I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to another newly recorded episode of Free Forum, A World That Just Might Work. And I'll be speaking today with Nathan Schneider about the ideas in his latest book on the power and potential of cooperative economics, co-ops. The book is called Everything for Everyone, the Radical Tradition That Is Shaping the Next Economy. After a 3-year hiatus since Trump's Electoral College victory, I've been doing a new interview every other week. Paul Hawken on climate change, Naomi Klein on her book No Is Not Enough, Arlie Hochschild on her book Strangers in Their Own Land and the Stories That Divide Us, Robert Wright on why he's a Buddhist. The show airs as specials on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn. Podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Podomatic.com, many other podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net. That's TERRENCEMCNALLY.net. One word. Now a plug for participation. Here's 5 organizations that can help you participate in politics in America and in your community. Indivisible.us. Indivisible started right after the Trump inauguration, and it has branches in at least 5,000 cities. It'll send you a thing every week saying, here's the issues, here's things to get involved in. MoveOn.org was a digital platform, activism platform for years, works much more closely over the last few years with grassroots on the ground. MoveOn.org. On a California basis, similarly, digital working with grassroots, Courage Campaign, one word, couragecampaign.org, and then 2 kind of specific, 5calls.org, that's the number 5 and the word calls. 5calls.org tells you calls that you can make that are relevant and timely, as you check it out. And Town Hall Project, one word, townhallproject.com tells you when your representatives are going to be nearby and holding meetings that you can attend and let them know how you feel. Now to today's guest. Mostly due to the campaigns of the Democratic candidates for president, we're hearing a lot of talk these days about socialism and capitalism. Who's a socialist? How do we define socialism? Elizabeth Warren has unveiled a number of ambitious plans to save capitalism. Because everyone can pretty much see that shareholder capitalism is not working for the majority of Americans. As Bernie Sanders pointed out from the debate stage last week, the 3 wealthiest Americans have more wealth than the lowest 90%. Nathan Schneider, who wrote a book about the Occupy movement, wants to remind us of a hopeful small d democratic alternative, cooperatives, jointly owned, democratically controlled enterprises that advance the economic, social, and cultural interests of their members. They often emerge during moments of crisis, not unlike our own, putting people in charge of the workplaces, credit unions, grocery stores, health care, and utilities that they depend on. And since the financial crisis of 2008, the cooperative movement has been coming back with some renewed energy. Nathan Schneider is a journalist and an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's the author of Thank You, Anarchy, Notes from the Occupy Apocalypse, and God in Proof, the story of a search from the ancients to the internet. He's co-editor with Trebor Scholz of Ours to Hack and to Own, The Rise of Platform Cooperativism, a new vision for the future of work. And his latest book, as I said, is Everything for Everyone, the Radical Tradition That Is Shaping the Next Economy. Welcome, Nathan Schneider, to Free Forum, A World That Just Might Work. And let me tell listeners, we're recording this conversation Wednesday, July 3rd.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, now I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we're going to talk about. So can you talk briefly about your path to the work you find yourself doing today? And feel free to go way back, mentors, turning points, moments of decision, that sort of thing.
There are lots of ways one could start. Maybe one piece that I kind of came to realize the significance of while working on this book was the experience I had in a high school I went to. I went to a alternative public school, kind of before there were charter schools and things like that. Some teachers with some radical ideas in my school district before I was born in Virginia created this alternative program that was really built around student self-governance. And So when I was a teenager, I had the very odd experience, not common for I think a lot of teenagers, of being in a school where I had the opportunity to help run the thing. We had weekly town meetings where most important decisions were made, and I got involved in that process and felt a sense of my own capacity, and not only my own, but a group of ordinary students' capacity to contribute meaningfully to decisions that affect their lives. And I think experiences like that, give me a sense of faith, even in a moment where maybe democracy seems like it might be on the way out. That self-governance is not only possible, but is deeply meaningful and is something that elevates us as human beings.
I must tell you that I actually co-founded a school quite like that in 1969 in Boston. And it was an alternative high school, private school, not public, but we had the same thing, a weekly meeting in which decisions were made by parents, teachers, and students together. So it's great to
Well, I commend you for that. It really, I'm sure you've influenced a lot of lives in the process of that work. It's just so important for people to encounter that experience early.
Yeah, right, exactly. To begin and to have to actually not just make decisions, but in this case, and I'm not sure that exactly how it was working in yours, but make decisions with the teachers and their parents. And it was small, but it was quite something. So how did this book happen, Everything for Everyone? And I mentioned you and Trevor Schultz had worked on another book in cooperative, so you could sort of tell us which came first, and what sort of sparked you to take this on. You're a journalist, so articles happen, they happen when you get an impulse, but when you decide this is the next book, that's a big decision.
For me, it is kind of the second half of a response to the 2008 crisis, right? You mentioned earlier that I also wrote a book about Occupy Wall Street. I think I spent the first 5 years of the decade following 2008 covering cases of resistance. I co-founded a website called Waging Nonviolence that covers resistance movements around the world. I was really focusing a lot of my reporting energy on understanding better how social movements work, how popular resistance occurs. And in the course of that, I ended up showing up at Occupy, for instance, before a lot of other reporters did, and hanging around a lot longer than a lot of others did, because I was interested in what is lurking behind the spectacle of movements. And one thing that happened there, and has happened in many other social movements before and since, is that people turn to forms of economics that allowed them to sustain their work, sustain their vision. And for a lot of those people in Occupy Wall Street, that was cooperatives. And so one thing kind of led to the other for me. And this goes way back. I mean, you think about, for instance, even Gandhi often insisted that the vast majority of the work was what he called the constructive program, the development of these small communities in which people would do handicrafts and do economic self-sufficiency. This is why the spinning wheel is on the flag of India. It's this reminder that in those acts of self-sufficiency, of community enterprise, we find inspiration for resistance, and we find the roots of our power. So this is something that goes back in so many social movements, and I just saw a really exciting resurgence of this cooperative tradition that made me feel it was time to tell that story and to document really just the amazing things I was seeing emerging quite quietly in the context of social movements around the world.
Very good. Let's talk just a little bit about Occupy. 2011, 2012. We're now quite some ways from it. What, you say that this book came out of sort of watching people as Occupy ended, what some of the folks who'd been involved in Occupy, when they had to say, okay, now what did I learn there and how do I make myself useful coming forward, that they began to start cooperatives. But in terms of your take on what Occupy accomplished, what it failed to accomplish, what the lessons are, what are your thoughts?
I think it was an outgrowth of a particular moment. It was an outgrowth of a moment after the Obama election, a generation that had participated in that very historic event, and then were kind of confronted with the disappointments of both the response to the financial crisis and other features of the Obama presidency, and had to kind of say, well, we got this guy elected, but what do we deeper than that, what do we really stand for? And what are our profound problems that are not being addressed in this political system? And so it was a departure from that political system, a performance kind of standing against it, in which felt to me more than anything, to go back to our earlier example, like a school. It was a bunch of people learning a lot and trying to discover together, and in an act of risk and resistance, what is it that we're really for? And out of that have come many things. For instance, many of those people are now involved much more directly in electoral politics. They're not calling it Occupy anymore, but they're, that work has driven them to change tactics and approaches. And then also many have gotten involved in things like cooperative enterprise, building alternatives. Same with the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter policy platform in the economic section mentions cognates of cooperative like 42, 47 times. And so these movements very much saw the challenge of bringing democracy into the economy as a kind of crucial outgrowth of the demands and the ideals and the convictions that they shaped through participation in the movements.
Mm-hmm. And what was your sense? Because I know this was very much a big conversation both during and in postmortems of Occupy. Was I think there was pretty much unanimity that it changed the conversation, that it introduced the concept of the 1% and the 99%, which I really do see. There'd been a few people talking about inequality before, but really making that point, and that has become, everyone kind of knows that lens to look through things, but it didn't actually take on the minimum wage or things like that. Jonathan Schmucker, who you may know.
Yeah, very well. I worked with him quite a bit at the time.
Okay, organizer for basically his lifetime, and became quite involved with Occupy and wrote a book, Hegemony How To, which I think is one of the worst titles for a great book I've ever heard.
I think that's right.
but his subtitle, A Roadmap for Radicals, that I liked. But he said one of the things he saw was that, and this sort of comes into that cooperative question. He said that he felt like the process, the rituals, became the focus rather than the accomplishments that might come out of that. Your thoughts?
Yeah, actually, Smucker and I were part of a group that was working on writing a book together at that time, in the midst of, the occupation itself, and we were trying to figure out what we wanted to articulate in the context of that movement. And the group ended up not really coming to a conclusion, and so we went off and wrote our own book. And I really like his book, but my approach is different. I think he wanted Occupy to be the kind of movement that would kind of encompass all the lessons he had learned about social movement organizing and be the kind of revolutionary moment that, to be honest, so many people in that at that time wanted it to be. My approach has been much more around documenting what was it and what did that movement and its limitations say about us, about the kind of culture in which it occurred, the political moment it was in. And I think of Occupy much less as a thing that happened, that ended, and that should be evaluated as such, than as a step toward other things. One way of understanding, I mean, for instance, when you talk about some of the things that you just mentioned, minimum wage efforts. Earlier you were talking about some of the political campaigns going on right now, the normalization of socialism. People involved in Occupy have gone on to do all of those things. Those particular strategies just didn't fit within the frame of the particular moment. But that was just a few months in 2011, 2012. If we see it in a longer context, I think it kind of puts less pressure on that moment and says, no, this is just part of a longer process. To me, one of the biggest challenges of any social movement is not what it's able to accomplish in the moment when all the attention is on it, but actually, is it able to evolve and develop and adapt new tactics and be responsive to the moment? And I think to the extent that participants in that have been successful, it's been their ability to pivot from that moment to what they do next.
Right. So in other words, when you're saying, when you look at Occupy, you don't see a bunch of camps that did exist and no longer exist. You see a number of people who carried whatever their previous experience was into Occupy and now carry that Occupy experience into the future. So for you, it lives in a way in the people who participated and learned from it and remain committed to probably the same vision that drew them to Occupy.
Yeah, and I think so, and I think it's also, Smucker is somebody who had so many experiences before. What I saw in that moment was so many people who were very new to this, having their first movement experience, and there are ways in which I wish it had been different. Maybe it's like, I'm not without criticisms of it, but I'm much more inclined to want to listen to what happened there than to just kind of list the ways that it's wrong. That said, I think Smucker's work is fantastic for charting out a path forward.
Yeah. So for folks, I will say again, Jonathan Smucker, and the book is Hegemony How-To, A Roadmap for Radicals, and I also highly recommend it. You found that once you started looking into cooperatives, that you found that in a way they were in your blood, that you found them all around you and in your family's history. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, in the course of working on this book, I had the opportunity to move to Colorado with my family, and this is where I hadn't grown up, but I had grown up coming here. This is where my mother's family is from. I'd grown up on the East Coast, and I started reconnecting with family members, many of whom are farmers in Colorado, and started kind of reconnecting with that, with those roots. And one thing I started suspecting is I knew my grandfather had worked in in the hardware business, and started noticing in my research how much of the hardware business was using cooperative models, and with the help of my aunt, was able to dig up the bylaws, the handbook of his company, Liberty Distributors, and there it says on the first page, this is a cooperative business. Even though in the context of the Cold War, in the context of that culture, he thought of himself and talked about himself as just a aspiring American capitalist, somebody who'd grown up on a farm with no electricity until the rural electric cooperatives came, who struggled to make it in business and just wanted to support small locally owned hardware stores. But the cooperative model, this model of shared ownership among those local businesses, was what he turned to. And it was also striking because you can't really think of anyone more different from the average Occupy Wall Street activist who got involved in cooperative cooperatives than my grandfather. I mean, this guy was a hard conservative, farm boy who was just trying to conform in the American business culture, yet. For a lot of the same reasons, that idea of community economy, he turned to the same model that these, scrappy anarchists were turning to. And that struck me, especially in this moment of polarization and this feeling that so many of us have no way to kind of cross a line and talk to people who have a different perspective. This is a tradition that really cuts across our culture in some really unique ways.
Mm-hmm. And just for people, I'm sure listeners are most of them are unaware of this. But so Liberty Distributors, not a big name we know up front. It's not a public-facing kind of thing. But Ace Hardware is also a cooperative, right? So why did cooperatives arise in the hardware industry?
Well, it was really an outgrowth of a much broader development of cooperative business across, especially rural America. Mm-hmm. In the late 19th century, farmers were dealing with an incredible asymmetry of power from the urban elites, from the people controlling the railroads and the access to markets. And so farmers started building what became literally called the populist movement. They had a political party. It was called the Populist Party, right? And this movement used as its basis, rather than turning to some, loud-mouthed demagogue, they used cooperative enterprise as the basis. And so in the process, as a means of countering the power of these urban capital elites, they used their own businesses that they would own and control as a means to counter that power. And in the process, they built a huge legacy of cooperative enterprise that includes brands like not only Ace Hardware, but Land O'Lakes, dairy, Cabot Creamery, cheese, the Ocean Spray, Sunkist. A tremendous amount of our agricultural production happens through cooperatives. I know my family came to Colorado through a beet processing company that is now a cooperative, and which my family still takes their beets to. And it's just very widespread in rural America, and we don't often appreciate the power of that. That most of rural America gets its electricity through rural electric cooperative businesses, and that's because of the kind of neglect and abuse that was suffered at the hands of the capitalist elite at the time. And it also means that some of the reddest parts of the country politically today are the ones most embedded in this cooperative legacy. When you look at why the Trump administration's effort to defund all of the cooperative programs at the U.S. Department of Agriculture failed, it isn't because the Democrats stood up. It's because, red rural communities depend on that funding, and they would not let that happen.
Okay, so let's talk again or expand a little bit on the shape of cooperatives again that we've both sort of said people may not know are cooperatives. So there's the farmers, and you actually tell the story of another relative who was involved with the Western Sugar Cooperative, as you said, the sugar beets, which I'm sure most people don't associate with Colorado. But that was a big one. So we've talked about farmer co-ops. Then there are utility co-ops. Tennessee Valley Authority, probably the most famous.
Well, it's not technically a cooperative, but it was an essential part of that structure. In the 19 teens and 20s, there were a series of experiments around the country where farmers were not getting electricity.
Right.
And this is just amazing. I mean, 90% of rural America had no electricity. This was far behind Europe at the time, and the big electric companies wouldn't go there. My grandmother grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, that did have electricity. It was like a totally different world from the farm that my grandfather grew up with none, and farmers started experimenting with how to build their own electrical lines. And then this really got supercharged in the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt had seen those early experiments while as governor of New York, and so as president really started encouraging them. The resources developed through TVA started powering some of these early efforts. And then in 1936, the federal government really stepped in big time and created one of the most powerful economic development policies in our history, which was the Rural Electrification Act, which really, it's a beautiful thing. They gave farmers access to bank rate loans. So basically let farmers have loans at the same rates that big banks get. It seems like a fair deal, right, to build these electric companies. And within a decade or so, virtually all of rural America had access to electricity through these cooperatives. And this remains a really powerful legacy of economic development. These cooperatives are largely still in place. And this is an example of how policy, once it levels the playing field, once it enables democratic enterprise to have access to the same kind of capital that fat cat capitalists get, you can have really shocking effects, and that's precisely what happened in that period.
Okay, so then let's talk. What about worker-owned co-ops? What's the distinction there?
So many of the co-ops that we've been talking about here are either consumer-owned, like those electric cooperatives, so it's owned by the ratepayers, or business-to-business ones, like the Ace Hardware, owned by the local business owners, or, for instance, Associated Press, owned by newspapers. But the tradition of worker cooperatives is also an interesting one. This is businesses that are owned by the people who work in them directly. The most important legacy to remember that's so often forgotten is that in the late 19th century, labor unions used cooperative development as a core strategy. Unions were very scrappy organizations. They didn't have a lot of the legal support they have today, and so they needed to build a basis of self-reliance. And they helped develop also consumer cooperatives, but also helped workers form their own workplaces, especially when they went on strike. So this was crucial to the strategy of the largest labor union of the late 19th century, the Knights of Labor. That legacy has kind of been lost since the advent of the newer union regime, and maybe it's time to bring that back. But worker cooperatives have been, a small alternative in American history. They've been much more common on an industrial scale in Europe, particularly in France and Spain. But the major development in the U.S. was in the 1970s, the rise of the ESOP, which is not a cooperative, but it's a trust that allows employees to own shares of the companies where they work. And in some of these cases, especially where they've ended up being 100% employee-owned in companies like New Belgium Brewing, the distinction with a co-op is pretty small. And this is a model that's enabled 14 million Americans to become owners of the companies where they work. And right now, we're in a moment of tremendous interest in employee ownership, where policymakers across the country are exploring strategies to support employee-owned businesses, both cooperatives and ESOPs. And so I think we're poised for a real renaissance. Just last year, a bipartisan, group in Congress passed the Main Street Employee Ownership Act, which is the most significant legislation for employee ownership in 20 years. So as that gets implemented, we may see some really important new financing tools come online to support this, to support turning the economy over toward much more widespread employee ownership.
Okay, and let me tell people that you're listening to Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Nathan Schneider about the ideas in his latest book on the power and potential of cooperative economics, of co-ops, everything for everyone, the radical tradition that is shaping the next economy. And you can learn more at Nathan's website, which is Nathan Schneider, Nathan, N-A-T-H-A-N, Schneider, S-C-H-N-E-I-D-E-R, nathanschneider.info. Okay, so then there's consumer co-ops, which that is a little different. Talk about that one.
So there are a range of consumer co-op models. We talked a little bit about the electric co-ops. Right. The other really powerful legacy in American history has been credit unions.
Right.
These are the largest capital holders, of course, in the cooperative movement. And this is a very, very widespread, powerful phenomenon. Also, really got supercharged during the Great Depression with enabling legislation. Right now, I think we're in a moment of reckoning for credit unions. They're really strangled by a lot of the regulations that have been imposed on big banks. And, I think we have to ask ourselves, what would it take to really enable this kind of model of democratic finance to become the norm? Right now, starting a new credit union is very, very hard. It's possible. We just, here actually in Colorado, just started a new one called the Clean Energy Federal Credit Union, a financial institution just devoted to financing clean energy conversions and solar panel installations and so forth. But that's a difficult tradition. Another important tradition in our recent history is food cooperatives. Mm-hmm. Now, these have mostly been kind of small and marginal in U.S. History, but they've been really important in developing the organic and local food movements. And they've kind of made a choice in U.S. culture to kind of stay small. And stay radical in certain respects and continue pushing the envelope. But as a result, they've ceded a lot of their market to companies like Whole Foods, which was founded by a former, food co-op employee. In countries like Italy, for instance, however, the largest grocery chain in Italy is a consumer cooperative. And so they've shown that it's very possible for cooperatives to actually not only build that alternative model, but actually to take over that market once they've created it. In our case, unfortunately, the cooperatives haven't really reaped the value of the markets that they've helped create. When I was a kid, the only way my mother could get soy milk was going to a little food co-op.
Yep.
Now she can go to virtually any grocery store. But it's the co-ops that helped build that market for those kinds of then alternative foods.
Talk just a little bit more about the problems that credit unions face. I recall when there was the notion following the crash of 2008 to move your money from some big bank that that basically helped usher in the crash, and then got a slap on the hand of maybe a fine that was just a cost of doing business. And people were promoting credit unions, yet the regulation that came in hurt credit unions. Talk to us a little bit about the specifics of that and why they weren't able to carve out better legislation, why they didn't have the power to carve out a little better legislation at that moment.
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, the moment around 2011, there was just before Occupy and around Occupy as well. There was a large Move Your Money campaign, and it was actually a tremendous moment for credit unions. Nobody remembers it except the credit union people, and it kind of gave them a taste that, hey, there's a new generation that actually cares about us. But it's true. By that point, many credit unions, few generations along the line, had kind of lost the spirit of their earlier founding, and really most importantly, had become so burdened by keeping up with the mounting regulatory infrastructure applied to all financial institutions and the demands of the high-tech economy that they had to constantly be adding new technology, that it became hard to have the kind of vision that motivated the early development of credit unions. It's very, very difficult to get these things started, to get them chartered. You have to have really tremendous capital reserves, which is especially hard in the communities that need credit unions the most. So I think we need a new approach. Just last year, some deregulation was passed that covered credit unions and what were called community banks,
right,
which many of them are really regional banks. There is political will to support credit unions, but it's often been kind of watered down by the power of bigger banks that are trying to lighten their own loads. And I think that's why it's important to develop a new constituency that demands something more of our financial system, that demands that we have not only a local credit union option that's been around for decades and is kind of clunky and so forth, but that we demand that we have access to a financial system in which we can do anything with a credit union. We can do business banking. We can do even kind of much larger scale investment banking. That we can use democratic finance, all the way up and all the way down. There are people in Congress like Maxine Waters, for instance, has proposed reorganizing the housing market along cooperative lines. There are ways of thinking about how to do that, but when we talk about reining in the financial system, I think we need a much bigger vision about not only what kind of rules we want to slap on the financial industry, but actually how can we cultivate a new kind of financial sector that is truly democratic and accountable. And that credit union legacy is something to draw on, but it's something we need to really advance on big time.
Okay, yeah, not just try to outlaw or deal with the worst excesses of big investment banks, but actually have a vision for how would we like it to look? How would we like this system to function? And let me just mention, one of the things I heard in what you described is something that I often mention on here, which is it's a form of regulatory capture in which I use the example of a landfill. When regulations on landfills are proposed, you will get the big players, Waste Management, Browning Ferris, those kind of folks, opposing until it becomes inevitable. Once it becomes inevitable, then they write the regulations through their lobbyists so that it only works for them and squeezes out smaller players. That's basically kind of a similar thing to what happened here, right?
Yeah, and that's a story we see all over the place, and the financial industry is certainly in that situation, and we're seeing that happen with the tech industry right now, where Facebook is begging for regulation because they are starting to realize, hey, with a few of these like burdensome rules in place, we're going to have a lot fewer competitors because startups just aren't going to be able to play in that world, and if they flub up a little bit on those regulations, we can get them. So it's it's a process. It's a story that repeats itself.
Okay, I'm going to read a couple of quotes just to, again, sum up and sort of establish the size of co-ops, and I'm going to refer globally as well as American. These are quotes from your work. Cooperative business shores up the area's burgeoning affluence. The mortgage lending credit unions, the babysitting time banks, the consumer-owned REI stores. People may not know that. REI, fitness equipment and wilderness equipment. And high country electric co-ops help plan out some of the famous resort towns in Colorado, where you're from. The International Cooperative Alliance, an organization whose existence I did not know until I read your work, calculates that the largest cooperatives globally generate about $2.2 trillion in turnover and employ about 12% of the employed population in G20 countries. 12%, okay, in G20 countries. As much as 10% of the world's total employment happens through co-ops. According to the UN, the world's 2.6 million co-ops count over 1 billion members and clients among them, plus 20 trillion in assets with revenue that adds up to 4.3% of the global GDP. So that's the size. Now, a lot of that, as we know, is, as you talked about, is Spain, is Italy, so on. But I was surprised to learn of the existence of something called the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers. Who are they and what role do they play?
So this was a consumer cooperative store founded in England in 1840s, 1844-ish, and it was kind of the founding moment of the Anglophone consumer co-op movement. Sometimes it's referred to as kind of the first cooperative. I don't think that's really true, but nevertheless, it emerged from among factory workers. In the moment where the industrial system was just really being born, and they're experiencing some of the kinds of abuses that we, the kind of Dickensian factory system, and they needed a place where they could get affordable, high-quality goods, and so they created their own store. Now, they were also part of a political movement called Chartism, which was demanding the vote for the working class. So this was also part of a resistance movement saying, look, we can build our own store and govern it ourselves. We should be able to help govern our society. They're demonstrating their capacity as democratic participants. And they also set out some principles, such as member economic participation and member governance and the role of mutual education, that were the basis of what became the international principles and international definition of cooperatives that is managed through the International Cooperative Alliance. And that's really important to recognize that this isn't just a local tradition. This is a global tradition, a global legacy, and going to those ICA meetings is like going to the United Nations. Where you're encountering farmers from India, credit unionists from Africa, people from all across Europe and South America and North America, and they're all learning from each other, and it's a really amazing thing to see when you ask yourself, what does the global economy look like? What does global business look like? This is a slice of it that really has a different set of values than what we think of as the global economy. Yet this is an important bedrock of some of the best parts of the economy as it is, and could be part of a much bigger part of the economy of the future.
So when we were talking about one last thing, when we were talking about credit unions, what role or how similar is the notion of public banks in that conversation?
There's a lot of commonality. And for instance, there's a public bank campaign going on in New York, and credit unions have been involved in it to some degree. Public banks are financial institutions that are tied to the state, some level of the state, federal or state or city, with the idea especially that these would hold the pension funds and the stores of capital that are managed or that are owned through that state entity, and that it gives the state much more capacity to make values-based decisions on how that money is invested. So let's invest it in local enterprise rather than just in the stock market. That's one reason people are interested in public banks, and credit unions too are a kind of private financial institution that allows a space for values in how we do finance. I think both are really resonant and should be thought of as complementary.
In that larger vision we were talking about before, if one has a vision of how the financial world how financial institutions in the financial world could work to serve the most people. Now, when we're talking about the history, early 20th century. The rural co-ops start because they've got to electrify. There's other things that happen. The Depression leads to legislation that makes it easier. There is a momentum to cooperatives. But after World War II, and this is a quote also of yours, in the United States, still reeling from the labor struggles of the 30s and fearful of communist revolutions abroad, an implicit deal was struck. Democracy would be for the voting booth alone, not the boardroom. Talk about that.
That's right. I mean, after World War II, you see a total drop-off in discussions about cooperatives. So you see this in economics textbooks. These models go from being like, one option of how a business might be structured to being this kind of either completely ignored or this kind of marginal counterexample that just needs to be dismissed as quickly as possible. And this is happening in the midst of a context where cooperatives are electrifying the country. It's a very strange turn, and I think it has a lot to do with anxieties around communism, fears that this was a kind of creeping socialism, as Eisenhower referred to a lot of these New Deal programs, and it led to a lot of these things going underground. So a lot of these big agricultural brands, the Land O'Lakes, the Ocean Sprays, stopped publicly identifying as cooperatives, and the visibility of this stuff just kind of faded. In the period just before this, the government was producing these documentaries all about, the cooperative future. There was this sense in the Roosevelt years that the next phase of democracy wasn't just, was in the economy. And we have an opportunity to bring that back now. I think that moment has passed where we need to hide, behind capitalism. But and already co-ops are starting to recover their brand. REI has co-op in their logo now, and more of these are starting to do that.
Okay, and so as you say, cooperatives seem to bloom at a moment of flux. They fill a need the market isn't filling, and so on. And so, as you going back to the start of the conversation, you saw people who'd been involved in Occupy get involved in co-ops. You see people looking for how do we solve this inequality crisis. And one of the things you point out is why not? That line that I said in that quote from you, that democracy would be for the voting booth alone and not the boardroom, that's a big deal. In other words, when you have the democracy defined as only about elections, then being a citizen is a seldom called on skill. It's a seldom called on capacity. And if the parties don't make you happy, or if the media's description of the party's activities don't make you happy, you might just say, well, I don't need to participate in democracy. This notion that you could actually have democracy at work, and I haven't looked this up in a few years, but it's my understanding that in Germany, every company with 2,000 or more employees must seat half their boards from among their workers. That sort of thing, I've often thought, is wouldn't it be nice if American unions did that? Because now what you're doing is you're beginning to bring democracy into the workplace.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'm glad it's been revived by Elizabeth Warren and her Accountable Capitalism Act. Whether you love or hate the name, where she's proposed a similar approach in very large U.S. companies, that there should be some worker representation. It is kind of shocking that this isn't a kind of norm. In a democratic society, why aren't there more democratic businesses? Why isn't there just that basic expectation that the business should in some way resemble what we aspire to in the polity? And this tradition of especially worker cooperatives seeks to has always thought that, has always assumed that yes, you need you want participation. And actually there's reason to think that might be good for business. Mm-hmm. For instance, to take that German example, when there was a unionization drive in a Volkswagen plant a few years back in I believe it was Tennessee or Kentucky.
Yeah, I think it was Tennessee,
The company, Volkswagen, a German company, used to that kind of co-determination, actually wanted unionization because that's a framework that they like working with. But it was the local politicians who opposed it. And this is and in the employee ownership research around ESOPs and in some cases worker co-ops too, we see pretty consistent evidence that employee-owned firms have productivity gains over similar firms that are not employee-owned, that people want to put more of their energy into their work when they know that they're not being exploited because they're co-owners. So this is maybe part of the reason that expanding employee ownership, bizarrely, is on both the Democratic and Republican platforms for 2016. The Democrats want it for income inequality reasons. The Republicans want it for kind of capitalist entrepreneurship reasons, but nevertheless, both see some merit in having an economy in which more people are owners of and are reaping the benefits of what they're producing.
Okay, I want to talk briefly about how this might be a solution or a pathway to deal with the tech giants. A few tech giants have utilized AI and machine learning to basically obliterate privacy and make fortunes, growing fortunes, off of our data. Can cooperativism play a role in dealing with all of this from the privacy angle and the shared prosperity angle?
I certainly think so, and I've been involved for a number of years now in developing a community around the world called platform cooperativism. Where we're basically just bringing the cooperative model into that online platform economy. So part of that involves developing startups that are cooperatively owned from the beginning, and when you look at these startups, they have a totally different logic. For instance, a medical data platform co-op in Switzerland called MeData, is owned by the people whose data is in it. Therefore, it has the highest, its highest responsibility is to protect that data, right? The whole logic of the company is kind of Google upside down. Rather than trying to extract data for the benefit of investors, the goal is to protect and secure and reap benefit from that data for the people who contribute it. And then you see that with the gig economy. One of our most successful examples is Stocksy United, a stock photo platform owned by its photographers. Not only does this platform pay these people really well because it's paying out its profits to the photographers themselves, but they've been able to attract some of the best stock photographers in the world to this platform and take a really nice slice of the top end of that market. And so this model presents, not only a way of doing things a little better. I think it would be nice to have, Uber drivers, owning Uber and that sort of thing, or owning some of it, or to have Facebook users have a seat at the table in the boardroom. That should be the kind of minimum demand. But the cool thing that really happens with some of these models is that you see the business model actually shift. The whole idea of what a platform is for could be different if we were thinking about these as serving their users rather than extracting as much as they can from their users for bringing returns to investors.
Very good. Now, we've got about 5 minutes. In preparing for this, I came across Gar Alperovitz's review of this book. I'm sure you're familiar with Gar, and he's part of the Next System project, and so I expected this would be positive. And he's positive to a point, and then he says, but the book doesn't really take on the hard problems. He says cooperatives do not by themselves construct either a renewed culture or an alternative political or economic system, that you might be mistaking the model for the system, and our focus needs to be on changing the system. What is the plan? It looks like shared ownership seems like a good formula for what you talk about when you talk about bread and roses for both delivering for workers, but also delivering for our whole culture, for our communities, and so on. And the progress, we said, was stopped by the Red Scare after World War II, and it's now picking up again. But what's the plan? What is it going to take to make this actually make a significant difference, and not just on the margins?
Well, Gar is someone who I admire a lot. He's been involved in so much. He's done so much, not only in this work, but around nuclear weapons and the Pentagon Papers, even. Yeah. But in some respects, I thought he took me to task for not being him. And actually, I commend his books to anybody. I mean, I think he does a really nice job of articulating what comprehensive system change could look like that involves not only cooperative business, which he's put a lot of energy into supporting, but also, public-owned assets and so forth. The goal of this book was not to outline a pathway toward utopia. The purpose of this book, I'm a reporter, is to document a legacy and a tradition that can contribute to that bigger story.
Since we have so little time, let me cut in for a second, Nathan. I understand that. What I'm asking now is I'm not asking the book. I'm asking you. In other words, you've been involved in Occupy. You're involved in this. You've got a vision of where you'd like to see society in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. How do you, Nathan Schneider, what do you think? If I were to say, if this is the last question, stand in the future, 20 years from now, did we turn things around economically and culturally in this country? And if so, how did we do it? How do we get where we need to get?
The beautiful thing about being a journalist is that is not what I am trying to do. What I'm trying to do is listen to the things that people are doing, the diversity of things that people are doing, and to let us hear more of that. For me to articulate the system that we need to have as an individual and to impose that on everybody else, thank goodness that is not what I'm aspiring to do. What I'm grateful for is the communities of people that are doing that together, with bringing people together from across race, across experience, across class. I really recommend organizations like GAR's Next System Project, like the New Economy Coalition, which is really the new container for the intersectional, anti-oppressive, cooperative movement forming in this country. To me, the answer lies in what we can build together, what communities like that are developing in their collaborations and in their messy network building, not in what one guy writing a book can articulate.
Okay. So given that this is a book that you worked on for years, what's the next question? What's the next thing you're listening for? This will be the last question.
To me, the big question that that I love to ask is, how can we advance democracy? How can we not only get into this trap, move beyond this trap that we find ourselves in the Trump era and of defending institutions that have already failed, right? How can we advance democracy into the next phase? How can we learn from those legacies that have preceded us to build into what the next democracy looks like? I don't hear that question asked nearly enough. I hear much more of the kind of defense. To me, that is an open question. We don't know the answer to that, and it's that adventure of trying to figure out what the next democracy could look like that has excited me most about being part of and documenting these movements.
Very good. So again, the book is Everything for Everyone, the radical tradition that is shaping the next economy. The website is nathanschneider.info. That's one word, Nathan, Nathan, Schneider, Schneider.info. For this conversation and many other interviews, articles, some transcripts, and to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net. That's TERRENCEMCNALLY.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. A World That Just Might Work, all one word. If you want to receive my weekly email announcements telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and usually 8 to 10 articles that flesh out the conversation, sign up at my site or email me at temcnally@mac.com, mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and many other services. You can find years of podcasts at my site or at Apple Podcasts or iTunes. Listen anytime, anywhere. Archives include Michael Lewis, Jeremy Scahill, Naomi Klein, Robert Reich, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Greg Boyle. You can also follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to G. Lee and Mark Maxwell in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all, you, my listeners. Please share this podcast widely. Thank you, Nathan Schneider, and keep up your good work.
Thank you so much.